My name is Deborah Brosnan. I'll be moderating this afternoon's session on something that's very close to my own heart, which is putting coral reef restoration at the heart of conservation, ocean conservation. We have our panel here to lead this discussion. Tom Moore from KAUS, King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. Sandra Silva, who's the General Manager for Mary Kay here in Portugal. And Yava Batista, who is the Deputy Head for the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, the UN Global Coral Reef Fund. So coral reefs are one of the most iconic and beautiful ecosystems of the ocean. They occupy less than 1% of the seafloor, yet they support 25% of marine biodiversity. They're worth 36 million a year in tourism. They support about 1 billion people. They help us with climate change, combat sea level rise. And yet it's no secret that even though we all love and value coral reefs, they've been in decline for years. I think it was Tom Chi from Google who said we lose more corals in a day than we can currently restore in a decade. So the situation of corals has not been good for some time. But yet, what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing and from the panel today is that there's hope for coral reefs, and that hope is coming from a very new way of thinking and a way of acting and a way of bringing funding, science, and communities together. And that's what I'm hoping that we'll hear a little bit more of today, and look forward to getting your thoughts as well. Now, as some of you know, on Slido, you can submit your questions and I'll see them here, but also towards the end we will have some time for questions microphone. So please get ready to ask some questions. So with that getting started, Tom, I want to start with you because you're a practitioner really of coral reef restoration, and you've been doing this for many years and now working on a very large scale project over in Saudi Arabia. Could you tell us a little bit about how you've seen the coral restoration evolve and where you think we are today?
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. So I've been very fortunate to be part of this conversation on coral reef restoration since before coral reef restoration was really a topic that anybody talked about. And when we got started thinking about reef restoration, it was really in the context of thinking about how we would fix sites after ship groundings. It was thinking about things that we could do for local conservation efforts and stewardship. But really the prevailing thought at that point was that the solution for the coral reef crisis in the early 2000s was still the very traditional approach of addressing climate change, marine protected areas, dealing with overfishing, and dealing with land-based sources of pollution. And at that point in time, we really, even those of us in the field starting to do restoration, really didn't really see a place for it at the table there, and it's certainly not globally. But in the Caribbean, we unfortunately had one back-to-back event after another that was seeing decline of those reefs, and we eventually ended up having to put a few species on the United States Endangered Species Act list and the IUCN Red list for corals. Right. And as part of that, really, we started to have conversations with people about how we would address recovery of these species. And we talked with experts from the Smithsonian Institution, and they said, get more aggressive faster than you think you need to be. Work harder, take risks, take on challenges there. And so we started to really put a lot of effort into that. But there was really still not much investment being paid to it, except for, partners that have been around for a long time in this space like Mary Kay. But otherwise, there wasn't that much. It was small NGO-driven efforts. And globally, it really wasn't paid much attention to until the global coral reef crisis really started to hit in the earlier part of this last decade. And so as that happened, all of a sudden, people started to realize that even if we addressed all these other problems that reefs face, even if we did some of these other things, that we weren't going to have enough reefs left to regenerate themselves, even as that stability took place. And so we really needed to focus a little bit on recovering what we have, building up the genetic diversity in those systems. And so really restoration started to become a much more prominent part of the conversation. But to do that, we needed a project or projects that would really take it from the small-scale NGO-driven model to a large-scale restoration approach that you could really think about taking a more industrial approach to really deal with the problem at hand. And so I was fortunate to be part of founding a group called the Coral Restoration Consortium to bring together practitioners, and then to become part of this project at KAUST, which is really designed to be a demonstration of what reef restoration can look like at a much more unprecedented scale. We're taking a 100-hectare site initially and developing the strategy to restore that site in the same way we would take a terrestrial approach to restoration planning. And so it's a different way of thinking from doing restoration projects the size of this room to doing restoration projects the size of this section of Lisbon. And so it takes a different set of mindsets. And so we're excited about kind of making that investment, making a lot of mistakes, spending some of the money that other projects don't have the luxury of being able to spend, so we can get something started there.
And I think that's a really interesting point about the fact that it's not just building up, it's a completely new mindset in how we restore coral reefs and how we approach it. But going with that mindset that we're not just restoring a bay or our favorite dive site or something like that to more industrial, I think requires very different kind of funding as well and a very different look at it. And Yaba, that is exactly where you come in, right? With maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what's happening at the UN and the work that you're doing with the fund.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and it's great to be here with my fellow panelists. Tom was referring to how the restoration seascape has evolved in the last years or decades, and we have seen the same thing with financing for the environment. 30 years ago, when the whole environmental movement with multilateralism started in the Rio Convention, we were just taking baby steps. We are now 30 years from there, and everything was about grants. Everything was about, we need grant money from the rich countries to help us save our environment. And moving forward, today we know that grants are not enough. And that is why blended finance mechanisms are now part of this financial toolkit that we need to use to be able to attract the financial resources that are actually required to be able to actually fund very expensive and sometimes complicated initiatives related to coral reef restoration. And that's where an instrument like the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, which is actually a global coalition that brings partners from the UN, governments, private sector, and NGO comes in. We have two main instruments within our structure, a grant fund that actually it sits within the UN system, and this grant fund, it helps to develop the enabling environment and helps to de-risk opportunities to then build a pipeline of projects that can then create what we call reef-positive businesses and reef-positive financial mechanisms. And then there is an investment fund that can come in with big private equity investments for this. And just to finish on this quick introduction, why is it important that we have these types of new financial mechanisms and blended finance mechanisms in place? Last December, at the Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal, for the first time, finally, we do have a blue and a green print to figure out where we need to be in 2030. So we only have 8 years. So we've been talking for 30 years about all this. Now we have only 8 years to actually make it happen and be on the pathway to actual sustainability. And that one of the key targets there calls for mobilizing $200 billion a year between now and 2030. We cannot do that with grants again. And just to put it in perspective, $200 billion a year is about 1/3 of the money that we actually need to be invested in the environment.
That's quite shocking, actually. But at least I feel that things are moving forward. There's a plan and there's a goal for it, which is exciting. Sandra, Mary Kay has been working in this area for quite a long time, but through a very different lens, really through philanthropy at an organizational level. And I know, too, very much involved in empowering women. But you've certainly been working on coral reef restoration. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your approach and how you see that changing as well.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank the opportunity to be here. We all know that oceans are very important for the livelihoods of billions of people, and it's also very important for the economy. The oceans, in the case of Mary Kay, they help power the economic opportunity for our independent beauty consultants around the world. 25% of Mary Kay's volume of trade moves by the ocean. So for Mary Kay, it's very, very important that the sustainable use of the ocean resources are done in a sustainable way, and we are very committed from the beginning to partner with the Nature Conservancy, and this partnership stretches back in time more than 32 years, so a long time ago we started this partnership. And one of the important projects that we have supported and we keep supporting with the Nature Conservancy is in the coral reef restoration, and there's a specific project called Super Reefs. And super reefs, as you probably know, are coral reefs that are extremely resilient because they can survive a warming ocean. And the mission of the Super Reefs team is to identify, to protect, and grow a global network of coral reefs to secure the future of coral reefs and build a new generation of resilient corals. So for us, it's very important. And we are extremely committed to continue this partnership with the Nature Conservancy and all the important work that they do. This team, they bring together reefs governments and also communities with experts in various areas, and also we partner with university. So we are proud to be doing this work. We know that the partnerships with the private sector are extremely important, and there's a lot to do. So we are committed in the long term for the future of coral reef restoration, as it's very important to marine biodiversity.
Yeah, and I love that you brought out how important it is in terms of transport of your goods by sea, 25%. I think this really brings home the value of reefs, but conservation, but also directly to people's lives and businesses. One of the things that's coming out already is how much work is being done and how diverse it is, and yet how we're beginning to scale it up and how collaborative it is. And I'd like to kind of open this up a little bit to discussion with you, which is we like to go out and restore coral reefs, but it's not that easy. And it's not that easy because it's a hard thing to do. We're working in the ocean, and also because some of the policy issues. So maybe you can explain a little bit about how you face those challenges, and you too, Yaba, about what you're seeing. Like if I came tomorrow and said I want to restore a reef, what would you do for me, and how would you help me, all of you?
Yeah, so I'd first tell you you need to understand a little bit more about the reef you have and why you don't have a reef to begin with, and what your goals are, right? But no, this is the reef restoration space is at an exciting time, right? Because there's a lot of interest in it. But the reality is, as all of you know here, working in the marine environment is really hard. Adding coral reefs on top of that's even harder, right? And often the things that we think will succeed on a project are the things that fail, and sometimes the things we think are going to fail are sometimes the things that ultimately succeed. And so there is still a bit of learning that we have to do, and every individual place is different. You need to start in a progressive way to then get to scale on the project. So I would caution people to really, as they look at reef restoration projects in their region, they look at partnering with people there, to really dig deep in making sure that the people you're working with, the people you're partnering with, have gained that experience, right? One of the big problems we've had in this space is there's been a constant desire for everybody to reinvent the wheel rather than learn from each other in the process. And I think we need to really lean into that opportunity to learn from the people that have done this before, because even though many of the older projects were very small scale projects, they worked out the things that are the foundation of these bigger projects now. And now what we're having to add in now as we look at projects like ours is then how do we take some of the biological problems that we've solved at the small scale and then implement them at an industrial scale, and really think about it more as a marine construction type project moving forward.
Yeah. So let's say we've learned so many lessons. Tom has shown us some of the lessons he's learned. And somebody comes now to your fund and wants to do coral reef restoration. What kind of challenges are you seeing that they're facing that maybe Tom, as a practitioner, isn't facing, for instance?
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. And I think actually the challenges that Tom describes actually go along with the challenges that we have on the financial side when working on coral reef restoration. So one of our programs is actually, one of the early programs is in the Bahamas, and actually also in partnership with the Nature Conservancy. And we are working with them and also a company called Coral Vita. Some of you may know them. They won the Earth Prize Shot, I think it was last year. And Coral Vita basically is a company that is dedicated itself to to farming coral reefs inland. So they are developing different kinds of technologies to do this. But one of the challenges that companies like Coral Vita have is that they don't necessarily have enough funding yet to demonstrate the commercial viability. And that's part of the work that we are doing with them, is supporting them financially through flexible financing so that they can demonstrate their commercial viability in order to be able to scale up restoration efforts, because it requires a lot of time. And if we want to do restoration properly, we need to scale up the actual reef fragments production, for example.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the ability to implement these projects and programs, because in our experience, there's often a permitting process to go through, and there's a regulatory process to go through, and there's a legal process to go through. Do you think that we are at a place where we have enough to do that, so that, or is this an impediment to people who want to take on a project? And that's open to all of you.
I'll be happy to take that on. This is really part also of our model in terms of supporting reef-positive businesses and financial mechanisms, and it's a policy angle. There are a lot of still policy vacuums related to coral reef in general, including restoration. Permitting is a massive issue in different parts of the world, in developed and developing countries. Why? Because when you're restoring reefs, and Tom is the expert here, but you're putting materials in the water. So you need to regulate what kind of materials are actually going to go into the water. You need to make sure that they're not going to harm the environment. You need to figure out the regulations around where exactly should I put these materials, because you don't want to restore a reef where there wasn't one before, because that may affect your ecosystem, and you also don't want to introduce invasive species through a reef restoration program. So the whole policy environment has to be harmonized across different sectors. And this is important because if we are to scale up, private sector investors will want to know that they are doing the right thing, because a lot of them want to do the right thing, but they don't know what is the right legal policy framework in the water to be able to do this. And they want to be reassured that they are going to have their return, but that also they are going to have a positive impact.
So it's almost like, if I hear you correctly, it's almost like we need almost like a global EIA type approach where we look at the risks and there is a standard that can be applied. And it seems like every country may have its own right now. Sandra, I'd like to turn back to you, because a lot of the work that Mary Kay does, and I want to talk about this in terms of engaging the community, and particularly engaging women and women in science, I think is critical for us going forward. In your work, we all talk about engaging community, but it can be harder to do, and it can be particularly harder to do when you're trying to focus on a particular segment. How do you go about it, and what's your thoughts on it?
Yes. So we look at sustainability and not as only an environmental issue only, but we look at it holistically as an empowerment, as a women's empowerment company and entrepreneurship. We look at all issues in terms of how we can help the world be a better and safer place by empowering women. And we feel that communities, and women in particular, must be empowered to participate in local conservation efforts and also nature-based solutions. So again, with the partnership that we have with the Nature Conservancy, we have supporting two very specific initiatives led by women. One of them is in Papua New Guinea, Mangoro Market Mary, and this Mangoro Market Mary is a market that markets sustainable mangrove products. And by marketing these products, we have been able to protect mangroves from being harvested. And through this partnership, we will also be providing women with training on leadership, financial literacy, management, and this generates income and employment, and this is very important for the impact that we want to provide women, specifically not only in business, but here we are talking about really the environment, because as a women's empowerment company, we look at empowering women in all facets, not only in business, in life, but also environmentally. And the other initiative also partnering with the Nature Conservancy is also a woman-led initiative in Kauai in the Solomon Islands. And through this partnership, we are helping secure sea turtles and also conduct trainings for communities. So answering your question, it is hard, but it is possible, and we are making efforts towards it through the right partnerships.
Yep. So you both want to jump in. So Tom, Yava, yes, great.
So I think it's, to lead on to Sandra's point there, is that it's important to remember as we think about reef restoration, we talk a lot about technological solutions, and we're fortunate in the project that I'm helping lead to lean into those, right? But the vast majority of coral reefs that are in need of restoration around the world are in developing countries and in places that we weren't necessarily able to lean as heavily into some of those technological solutions, right? And so we need to think about this as we think about restoration as developing techniques, developing approaches that can work within these various places. And one of the things we're trying to do with the project that we have is to learn things and then begin to be able to export those things both along the Red Sea to our neighbors, but then elsewhere in the world, right? But it's really important to not just always go with the next shiny technological solution, but to really lean into sometimes just the solutions of the people that are within some of these communities. Arguably, the largest restoration project in the world right now was an effort led by the government of Indonesia that took fishermen and people from the tourism sector that were out of work during COVID and put them at work to do restoration, right? So there's lots of solutions, and you really have to find the solution that fits for the community that you're in.
Yeah. Yeah, but you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, actually, to both points. I think on the general community aspect, and this was mentioned yesterday during several of the Blue Finance sessions, when we're talking about investors, private sector coming in, we know we need a lot of money, but that doesn't necessarily mean we need super big checks to get these projects going and to get these new ways of sustainable financing being truly sustainable into the future. We also need to look at what it's called the missing middle. So like the $500,000 to $8-10 million of investments, because there is a lot of really good work happening within that range of financial resources need, and we cannot forget them, because these are exactly also the kinds of investments that are not only going to help continue to preserve the environment, but they are also going to generate jobs for those communities, which is essential because they are the ones that are there. We are here enjoying everything that they are doing when we go and take a plane and go for tourism in the Bahamas or anywhere else in PNG or Solomon Islands. And you were talking, Sandra, about the role of women, and I think it's not only possible, as you were saying, it's necessary. Women are half of the world population. They represent new opportunities in terms of economic development. They are at the forefront of the stewardship of coral reefs and everything that those coral reefs depend. And also, they are the ones that really drive the communities in most of the places where we work. So if we don't have women included through these financial mechanisms, through these investments, through initiatives like the ones that were described by Sandra, we're losing half of the battle already.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's really spot on. I have some questions here, but before I go, I'm going to take some questions that came in from the audience on this. So, which is, how can we make sure that the agreements to fund coral reef restoration are legally binding, and what mechanisms can be employed to make it a reality? Who would like to take this?
Well, I'm not sure what the person asking this meant by legally binding. But I go back, I would say it's legally secure. What we need to strive for is really having those laws and regulations that are going to make everyone feel secure that the investment that they are doing, that the effort that they are putting is going to be safeguarded. We do know of entities that, for example, they have not been able to work on scaling up their reef restoration efforts because they are not able to get the permits that they require to plant the reefs. If a company cannot get the permits, they're not going to be able to raise money. Yeah. That gives security to everyone.
Yeah, I want to jump in, though, on that point, though, because I think that, granted, the regulatory environment can be challenging at times, but like the regulatory environment's supposed to be challenging, right? It's supposed to make you answer a few hard questions before you just kind of get started at the work, right? And what I've found is having the opportunity to work in a lot of places, it's all about a conversation, and it's all about you having the credentials yourself in that process, right? The groups that tend to struggle the more in the regulatory space are the ones that just want to pop up somewhere and do work. Maybe they're parachuting into some place and they want to do work within that community, right? You want to build your credentials up within that community, right? And you want to make sure you come with a solid line of experience. Don't go big until you've kind of demonstrated yourself small. And my experience with regulators on this is that they often say, just come have a conversation with us before you submit us a piece of paper. So I think it's one of those things we shouldn't get overly afraid of, and it really gets back to making sure as you think about projects, you start small and measured within a place, even though this is a huge problem, right? Everybody wants to go big, quick, and it's a huge problem. You'll probably be more successful, walking before you run in this regard.
And I think this I'm not sure exactly what the question meant, but I think too, one of the things that may be coming in is accountability. When you see people say, I'm going to put money into reef restoration, and there's a big splash about how much money is going to be contributed, funded. We see it in some of the COP events at the UN, to be blunt. And then the next year you find out that it was really an empty promise and nothing was given. And I don't know that we can tackle this here other than to try and hold people accountable as much as we can.
I put that on some of our partners in the media that may be here and others, right?
Yep.
I think it is important that you do, as you're looking at projects, that whether you're looking at a project as an investment or you're looking at a project to help amplify their story, that you do the due diligence on it. I've seen so many of these empty press releases. They get their articles, they get their things out there about this grand technology that they've developed, right? And it gets splashy, but nothing comes from that. And most of the time, nothing comes from it because either it was empty promise to begin with, or they hadn't done their due diligence up front on that work and realized that it's hard to work in these spaces, that you're going to fail before you succeed. And so I really encourage people to really do your due diligence before you get too wrapped up in some of these excitement things that are happening in this space, because we're lucky to have a lot of interest in it, but with that interest can come some problems too.
If I can add one point on the accountability point, I think there is another side to accountability that it's related to measuring impact. And this is one of the challenges that we have seen across our programs around the world, is that we still have very little data that related to coral reefs that can actually help us set up the baselines for us to be able to track environmental, social, and economic impact. And this is important for that accountability aspect, because without this, we cannot show the environmental conservation progress, but at the same time, in our case, since we are in a blended finance approach, and everybody that is working now on impact investing and all that, it's not only about the return. You need to measure also the environmental and social impacts. And if we're not able to measure that, then we don't know what's working or not. And so we need to make sure that we are bringing together the policy, the science aspect, and the financial aspects truly to the table at the same time.
Yeah, and I think I'll come back to that in a moment. I think that's a very good point that I've thought about. What is success? But before I do that, there's a question coming for you, Sandra, which is, again, related to this part of the discussion. How does Mary Kay keep track of its support for coral restoration and social projects? Do you have general reports from the organization on the ground, or how do you keep track?
Yes, so the Nature Conservancy released a report in 2022 measuring the Global Reefs Impact Report, and it's mainly through that report that we keep track of how we are progressing through this partnership. But just like you were saying, I think it's very important that we have this triangle, right? The financial, then also the science and the management. And the management piece is very important. And I think it goes back to what Tom was saying too, that it's at the beginning of the projects that we need to know exactly what do we want to accomplish, and then along the way measure it up. And with the Nature Conservancy, we do that, and specifically through these kind of reports.
Yeah, that's really good. I think being transparent in what we're doing and having those reports available. Plus, we learn from what happens, what we can do better. I think coming out is really key. I would like to open this to questions. I have a lot of questions myself, but I think I'm going to share it. So please state your name, and then if your question is directed to someone in particular, let me know.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Steve Bender, and I'm with the Rotary Reef Organization as well as EarthX. We began building rotary reefs in the Caribbean a few years ago in an effort to educate Rotary clubs around the world. There's about 35,000 Rotary clubs in 200 countries. Along the way, we stumbled into stony coral reef disease. So instead of working on this, we re-channeled ourselves to building reef banks. My question is, have you guys experienced stony coral disease? And is there any updates? Thank you.
I can start a little bit. While I work in the Red Sea now, I spent 20 years helping lead restoration in the Caribbean, so well familiar with stony coral tissue loss disease. And it's just kind of the latest of kind of insults that the reef has faced over time, right? And so as we do our restoration projects, we need to be smart about this, the individual species we select. We need to be smart about the individual genotypes we select to try to build some resilience into the system to make sure we're not kind of throwing good resources after bad after that. But at the same time, I'm a big fan of making sure we take a very diverse approach with our restoration too, right? Because while stony coral tissue loss disease is one of the plagues of today, we don't know what the plague of tomorrow will be, right? And so we need diversity in the system there. But it's one of the reasons too that when I am asked to think about success on restoration and things like that, it's not about restoring our way out of the coral reef crisis, right? The coral reef crisis is huge, and as Deborah was mentioning before, we're losing way more coral reefs than we're able to put back right now, and that's likely to continue even in the future. So reef restoration has got to be about maintaining the status quo, helping the system stabilize itself, making sure we have enough diversity left in that system so that as that system stabilizes, there's a path to recovery there. And then along the way, we can do things like reef banks, we can do things in particular places to make those places more sustainable and be banks for other places.
Right. Gentleman there, and then the lady in the front, if you'd bring up a microphone to her as well. So, go ahead. Yes.
Hi there. James Spurgeon from Sustained Value, a natural capital consultancy firm. So we're all aware that coral reefs provide a wide range of ecosystem service values of significant value, and that coral restoration costs a lot of money. Could you share your thoughts on what are the main or best potential sustainable revenue streams that might arise from these restoration initiatives, and also what are the key drivers to ensure that there's more of these initiatives that are successful?
Great.
So,
do you want to?
Yeah, I think I can take a stab at that question. I think this is essential. This question is really good because figuring out the revenue streams for coral reef restoration is essential for success. And there are several ways in which we're already working on this. One of them, for example, is to incorporate reef restoration within reef insurance schemes. So there are several reef insurance attempts around the world that have taken place. Actually, the first one that just did a payout after a tropical cyclone in the Mexican coast was designed by the Nature Conservancy, and we are working with them and other partners as well in developing reef insurance mechanisms. And for a reef insurance mechanism to actually be successful, they need to have a company, for example, like Coral Vita, that actually has built the infrastructure to actually have a coral farm and have the fragments that are required that are used then after a storm to be able to rebuild the reef. And a reef insurance mechanism can actually be a source of funding to actually be able to scale up coral farming. Another one is, and this is still under development, there are several institutions out there in the ocean space trying to develop biodiversity credits. Some are calling them coral reef credits, or others are calling them resilience credits. And this is like the next generation of credits. Everybody talks about carbon credits, but figuring out biodiversity or coral or resilience credits is a little bit more difficult. Probably we're going to have to start, as we are doing with carbon, with voluntary markets. So this is another revenue stream that can help put money up front so that we can finance reef restoration.
Okay. I'd like to kind of just add to that and get your thoughts on this from all of you, which is, I see too that there is interest in the investment community, which is really where you're coming from, and both in the technologies and also in the development community, because coral reefs basically protect land values, and that there are different revenue streams out there that can take coral reef to market, but I don't think we've explored many of them yet, and I don't know that all these technologies will be scalable and have a larger market. Tom, do you have something on that?
Yeah, just on this idea of revenue streams here, right? So I think it's important to recognize that every individual place where a reef exists at might have a different reason and a different driver for doing the restoration of that reef. And there may be multiple drivers even within that individual community, right? So I don't think we can necessarily fully box into individual revenue streams. But the point I wanted to make here was that I see in the same way that mangrove restoration and salt marsh restoration have gone from being kind of philanthropic driven efforts that were done by local community organizations in the 80s and the 90s to now being heavily engineering commercial scale efforts, right? And I see where the stream here being is a shift to more of the private sector in the coral restoration space, heavily informed by those previous efforts moving forward. And so whether that private sector's revenue stream on one project is tourism and another project is maybe insurance based and another project is something else, right? It's more about building that capacity to do that work. We also have to remember that, we have to make some of these investments in big projects to show that big projects can be done, which is one of the reasons that KAUST and the Kingdom are doing the project that we're doing, is to show that work can be done at big scale. Because in order to get that insurance company to pay for that reef for coastal protection, they need you to demonstrate to them that you can actually build a kilometer of reef. Yeah. We all know a kilometer of reef will do a lot in terms of actual protective value, but can you actually build it? Most people haven't even come close to a fraction of that yet.
And I think that's key, and I want to build on that a little bit, because Sandra, in a way, you've already been doing it. The projects that you talked to us about were, although they're investing in reef conservation, but they're investing in communities and investing in women's empowerment in business. So I think the models you're doing, you're already doing it in some way, and that we should look a little more closely at what you're doing and how that can fit into some of the larger areas. Just that the examples you gave us really demonstrate this. I'd like to, you had your hand up.
Yes. So, Yaba, I'm from the UN as well. And so I just want to say this. I think it's a couple of things important, and I've really been loving what I'm hearing, because I think we first need to educate people on what coral reefs are for the ocean. Because even the people that invest sometimes do not really know what they're exactly investing in. They just know it's reef restoration and it sounds good. We need to also look at the de-risk and risk of that, and why companies want to know if they're going to go into this with a positive impact, what are they going to get back? There's ways that we can offset that. The other thing is, you talked about women. So here's the question I have. We're dealing with women fisheries in 4 different countries, our group, okay? And you want to look at how women fisheries can fit into this. Because when they're going down to the bottom of the oceans, fishing every day, and looking at what's going on with the reefs, they can also be a source for a lot of, the Global Fund for Coral Reefs and for your investors and what they're doing. I'd love to know what you think about that, using the people who actually are in these countries to go down, using the local people, the rural areas, the indigenous, and paying them well, not just a little pittance and saying, I'll help you with your village, but actually paying them, connecting with them, and allowing them to also generate a viable business from that. And, what do you think about that?
Okay.
We're doing that, and I'll talk to you about it later, but I'd like to get the panel's input.
Yes.
Sandra, I think.
So, Mary Kay, through the partnerships that we have supported 2 initiatives in Solomon Islands and also in Papua New Guinea, and these are woman-led initiatives, and we want to elevate these woman-led initiatives, because just like we were saying here, if we miss out on half of the population in the world, we are missing on a lot. And it's not only on missing half of it, it's missing on women, and we all know that women are drivers in our community. We are drivers in families. So Mary Kay, through this partnership and through the support to these initiatives, clearly says how important it is to work with local communities, because just like you are saying, these are the ladies that really know what they are doing, and they are extremely committed and interested in the success, because it's their life, it's where they live. So it's very important for them, and we are for the support of the sustainability and also women's empowerment. And we want to by creating these sustainable programs, also drive diversity and empowering women as agents of change and community builders.
Great, thank you. We have 50 seconds left, so if you've got any, would you like to add to that?
I'll just add and say that I think
yes.
one of the things that's really important to remember is working with those communities, right? Because coral reef restoration is not rocket science, right? And the best people that I've seen do reef restoration are fishers within individual communities that know their waters, know how to be on boats, know how to work underwater, right? They need one technical science person for every 20 of the people that are actually doing the work, right? Don't be fooled by thinking that you need scientists. Honestly, some of the scientists are some of the worst people doing the work on the water. They fumble all over the place. You need the people that actually know what they're doing.
Right, yeah. So, well, they're there every day going back, so they've got the knowledge to see how the system is changing and how it's responding, and that, I think, is a critical component of it. And now we're at zero, so time zero. I want to thank all of you, but particularly our panelists, Tom, Sandra, Yaba, for really interesting discussion. Much more to say on this and much more to be continued. Thank you for your questions. Sorry we couldn't take more, but you'll be around to answer them. So thank you.